self-interest in his ideas. Rand tends to depict her characters as standalone, isolated units, to an extent that few other philosophers do. So, as an example, there are very negative depictions of family in her books. Most family members are parasitic on one another. The only good relationships in Rand's book are freely chosen. So there are no obligatory relationships that are cast in a positive light, only those chosen relationships. So you see here another reason why Rand is not fit with conservative values, in which family is a primary value, a primary good. But you may be thinking, what about libertarians? Libertarians are less religious. They're concerned about personal and economic freedom. They wouldn't have a problem with Rand. And as it turns out, many libertarians did love Rand, and they went on to promote many of the socially liberal policies on sex, on drugs, on the draft that Rand's philosophy supported. They also loved Rand's fictionalized portrayal of a capitalist world. Rand always emphasized that capitalism was an unknown ideal. It hadn't yet been achieved. And in Atlas Shrugged, she created a capitalist utopia rife with memorable characters and features that libertarians really grabbed onto. Atlas Shrugged enabled them to visualize what a world could look like were the state reduced to a minimum. Libertarians also adopted Rand's core political principle, the non-initiation principle. This held that any first initiation of force was unethical, and this principle went into the founding statement of the Libertarian Party in the early 1970s. Now, Rand extended this non-initiation principle, this critique of force, to include even taxation. In the objectivist philosophy, taxation is an initiation of force, so taxation itself is immoral. And the role of the state was minimal, restricted only to enforcement of contracts, maintenance of a police force, and provision of national defense. Now, how these principles would be put into action, Rand said, was not her concern, and it was not her role. She was pointing out that taxation was a form of force. She was arguing for the necessity of a minimal state, and she would let others work out the details. And work out the details they have. There is still a debate going on how this might work, and leaving some of this work undone actually has attracted people to Rand because it means there's something to talk about, there's something to figure out, there's something to argue over. Not just something, there's a lot. So it will go on. But perhaps most importantly for libertarians is that objectivism proposed individualism, selfishness, as an ethical value that you could organize your life around. It was enough. And that became the basis of an independent libertarian identity. And it was in the 1970s, drawing on Rand's ideas, that libertarians began to look at conservatives and say, we're not the same. We're different than you. We're going to start our own movement. And you see one of the first bifurcations of the ideological right. You didn't have to be part of the conservative movement. If you were a capitalist, if you were for limited government, you could say, I'm a libertarian, I'm a follower of Rand's objectivist philosophy, I'm an atheist, but I still share some of these ideas, but I don't have to be forced into being a conservative. You didn't have to be religious. You could use Rand's ethical system instead. So this is this irony that what made her most unattractive to conservatives made her most attractive to libertarians. What did Rand herself think of libertarians? Well, she thought they were, quote, a monstrous, disgusting bunch of people. Quote, plagiarizers. They were scum. And worst of all, they were, quote, hippies of the right. These were but a few of the insults Rand hurled at libertarians when they emerged as a self-conscious independent movement in the 1970s. Why did Rand hate libertarians so much? Well, she had three sort of interrelated complaints. One was that they were plagiarizers, they stole her ideas. And this was a difficulty Rand had in separating where her ideas began and the ideas of others who'd come before her ended. She tended to claim all advocacy of capitalism or limited government as her own. Secondly, she felt, and more philosophically, she felt there needed to be a moral defense to the basis of capitalism, specifically an objectivist moral defense. And if you defended capitalism without being an objectivist, you were getting it wrong, and that was almost more dangerous than being a socialist or communist, when at least we could see you coming and know where you stood. And so many libertarians did use objectivist ideas and philosophy, but they didn't use them according to the way Rand thought they should. So that became a very strong objection. And thirdly, she thought that all libertarians were anarchists. In other words, she thought that all libertarians thought the state should be abolished entirely and society should be entirely voluntary. Now, there was a strong strain of anarchism running through 1970s libertarianism, but Rand was wrong to claim that all libertarians were anarchists. There's, in fact, a robust anarchist-minarchist debate in the 1970s with the minarchists claiming Rand as their inspiration. But she missed all this and instead condemned libertarians for a variety of reasons. Still, there's no denying her impact on libertarianism. She's the founding godmother of libertarianism. You can see her imprint directly in organizations like the Cato Institute, the Libertarian Party. All of these libertarian organizations came out of the ferment of excitement about Rand's ideas in the late 1960s and 1970s. And this is one of the clear ways we can see Rand's ongoing influence today. Another way we can see it is in the career of Alan Greenspan, who, according to orthodox objectivists, is not an objectivist at all, as could be seen by his taking a role in the federal government he had once opposed. Nonetheless, Greenspan remained close to Rand throughout his career. When he was initiated as the economic advisor to President Ford, he invited his mother and Ayn Rand and her husband to the White House swearing-in ceremony. So she was well aware of his work for the federal government. And this is one of the ways in which her ideas got a wider hearing. But I want to close with the question of Rand's legacy beyond these two obvious points. In recent year, there's been a huge surge of popularity in Rand's work. There were about 300,000 copies of Atlas Shrugged sold in 2009 alone, which is a remarkable figure for a novelist who's been dead since 1982, whose major works were published more than half a century ago. She's been picked up by pundits from Glenn Beck to Rush Limbaugh. She was a recurring theme in our healthcare debates. She's been a Tea Party favorite. And I think it's too early to know exactly what all this means in the short term. Maybe if I was here in December, I'd have something more to say, but I think we're all going to learn a lot in November about what's happening right now. But to me, the Rand resurgence is interesting not just for how it maps onto the politics of today, but what it suggests about the politics of tomorrow. Rand is one of the few thinkers to bridge the gap between the social liberalism of the left and the fiscal conservatism of the right. Her popularity suggests we could be headed for a place where it's possible to be both fiscally conservative and socially liberal. She's one of the few thinkers who is a consistent defender of economic freedom and social freedom. That's part of the appeal of Ayn Rand, it's part of the trouble with her, and it's part of the possibility. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions. Hi. How did she defend her continued contact with Greenspan and the federal government? She was asked, the form of this question she was asked a lot was, is it moral to take a scholarship funded by the federal government? And so on the one hand, Rand was really an idealist who didn't like compromise, who believed in principles, but she also thought you had to start where you were. So to the scholarship question, she would say, accept the scholarship and use the scholarship to advocate for capitalism and a smaller government. So I think she probably understood it as a bit of a sort of Fabian-style strategy, get into power, and then use your position of influence to make the case for limited government. And it is true that she urged her followers to go to school, to get good grades, to really apply themselves, to become professional. And this is another aspect of Rand's appeal in the 60s. If you were an anti-war protester and a hippie, you tended to drop out of mainstream society. If you were an objectivist or a conservative, you tended to work really hard to get as high up in that mainstream society as you could. So that's one reason among many for the sort of diverging fortunes of left and right. So she didn't tackle that head on, but she made very clear that she was proud of Greenspan, that she considered him, an ideological child of hers. And she died in 1982, so his career was just getting started. So I don't know what she would say about the remaining part of it.
In Atlas Shrugged, when she first arrives in the canyon and kind of realizes money's worthless and nothing's free, you have to pay 25 cents to borrow a car. After that, someone bumps her a cigarette. So I kind of saw a conflict there. It kind of led me to wonder, what would Ayn Rand do if she walked down the street and saw a beggar? Would she just keep walking, do you think, or would she feel that if she chose it was right to help?
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
So what would Rand's response be to seeing someone asking for money on the street? And this is a broader question. Where does charity fit in Rand's ethical system? And for her, charity was fine if you chose to do it. So if you looked and said, it's against my values to see a starving man on the street, I'm going to give him a sandwich, that would be fine. What would not be okay was your teacher or your parent or a politician saying, it's your duty when you see that starving man, the only way to be a good person is to give him money. That she didn't like. So she didn't like commands telling you what to do and telling you that you had to be charitable, because she saw that as a command to sacrifice some part of yourself for this other person. So it's a question of what is left out of her system. So charity is left out of the system. It's not relevant to her. Now, most other moral systems say charity is a very important value. We need to focus on it, and we need to think about all the different ways it can work. And that's just not important to her. So, in the far back.
Is Rand possibly late to the argument, more redundant to conservatism? Didn't conservatism exist with Jefferson, or more modern in the 20th century with Coolidge?
So question is,
The golden age of capitalism, Morgan and Rockefeller, Ford, weren't those forces already well set in American political thought and commerce without Rand?
so it's a good question. Weren't there all these forces of capitalism and markets in place, and so is Rand sort of late to the game? I think I would answer that question by looking at the intellectual context of the 1930s. The aftermath of the Great Depression, there was a wide consensus that capitalism had failed somehow. And Rand was one of the few people to depart from this intellectual consensus and say it hadn't failed, and to make that argument in books and in popular medium. Now, I happen to think that my profession of historians has tended to ignore all those factors you cited. We tend to start the story in the 1930s when everyone's on the left, and we tend to focus a lot on intellectuals and people who've made a lot of noise and gotten a lot of books written about them, and we've forgotten about this other piece. So I do think that all of these elements were there. She didn't bring them to America, certainly. I think she helped bridge a gap when these ideas weren't discussed in a lot of places, and then she created a way in to this ideological world when there weren't a lot of ways in, when there was a sort of broad consensus that the welfare state is okay, that government interventions in the economy. She was one of these few voices to be speaking out against it. So no, she didn't create conservatism. Conservatism didn't come out of nowhere. Historians generally discuss a new kind of conservatism starting in the 30s or 40s, that's grappling with the reality of an expanded state rather than in the 20s when you had a more business-friendly culture. Does that make sense to you?